Welcome to a lecture on typography design by Lisa Gabrielle. Okay, so today we're going to talk about typography. And this class is one of the few classes that we actually introduce and talk about typography as a separate entity. Most of the time in most classes, you might use type design here and there, but a discussion and a lengthy, thorough, I guess, study of type doesn't exist. So I'm hoping to instill a couple of weeks into your study of isolated focus on just type. And I'd like to introduce you to some of the concepts of typography design in this lecture. Okay, so to begin with, what's interesting about design is that a large part of what designers work with involves text and typography. And most of the courses taught in colleges and universities focus mostly on image work. And there's really not enough emphasis, at least in this program, on manipulating text and working with type as a design tool. So uh, I'm going to try and instill some, I guess, sensibilities in you early on so that you can use these sensibilities to help you manipulate text no matter what class you're in, whether you're in web design class or animation or basic graphic design or digital publishing. All of those courses are new media design. All those courses are courses where you might find this lecture handy or helpful. As you know, type plays a large role in what we do each and every day. We don't notice it, but we encounter text and we encounter typography everywhere we go. And generally, when we encounter text, we are receiving a message of some kind when we read a line of text. And the idea is that in that moment that we read that text, that the idea is understood and the concept is clear. And I think, in essence, going into learning about text, that's what you need to remember is unlike sometimes an image might have some ambiguity, and we might intentionally try and put some ambiguity into working with images. Generally, when you work with text, it's a very literal representation. However, there are some cases where text is represented as art, and in that sense, it um, can be a bit confusing. But generally, most of the time when you're working with text, it has to be very legible and very readable and very understandable. So keep that in mind as you continue to work with text. As it says here, typography creates relationships between different types of information, both organizing this information and keeping it interesting. So a lot of times a line of text can act as a transition from a piece of imagery or a piece of artwork over to a paragraph of body copy or a block of text. As I said, legibility is key to making text work best for you. And in most cases, when using text, you want to make sure that the message is clear. There's some things that you can use. These are all stylistic techniques that are available to you to make text more legible. And in my digital publishing class, the students are working on a project where they are using some of these tools, such as similarity and alignment, uniformity and consistency, to represent text treatments. So um, a lot of people don't even think about these particular things and don't know they're available when using typography. So keep in mind that when working with text, you want to create relationships between similar kinds of things. Um, when working with text, you want to maintain a system of consistency so that, and an example of that might be if you're working on a project and you have to make a choice about different type fonts. One of the general rules that I usually tell students to maintain consistency is to limit the choices of typeface to one or two throughout an entire project. That way, your project looks uniform and you maintain a consistency throughout. Also, consistency is good, but contrast also can be useful. And you want to use contrast in different ways when it comes to text. You could use weight contrast, for instance, like bolding something, and then the heavy weight of the bold next to the lighter weight of the medium or the regular creates a sense of contrast. So keep those things in mind. Just like in art and painting and drawing, we have to learn a lot of these design principles. They apply here for designing with typography as well. As I mentioned, the legibility factor again comes into play, and what are some tools that can help you use or apply legibility to working with text? And one of them is a font family, and what a font family is. And if I can jump here in, I think I have an InDesign document open here. A font family is recognized in the control panel across the top when you pull down and select a typeface over here to the left. And the second bar is the example of all of the different, let's say, children of that font family. So ultra light, condensed, bold, those are all part of the Universe family. Okay. Font size, letter, word spacing, and line spacing and alignment are all used to create a sense of legibility when working with text. And you're going to get into working with these individually, and you're going to get into finessing these um, with each and every type block that you work with in your projects in here. Okay. Um, This slide here is talking about legibility and font families, and it goes into the different areas of the anatomy of text. And again, this slide is pretty good in showing you what a stroke is in terms of the letter form and the different areas, what a line is, and where to distinguish those areas. I have another handout that's available in the classroom. I'm going to go back here and open that up. It's this handout here. And this handout goes into a little bit more depth in terms of type anatomy. And it explains things like what's an uppercase letter, what's a lowercase letter, what's a counter space? The counter space is generally the inside of a letter form. Anytime you have a G or an O or a P, this space that's inside the letter form is called a counter. It talks about things like ascenders, which are letter forms that jut up to the same height as an uppercase letter, has like an extension that jets upward, a ascender. Anything that any character or letter form that has a stroke that descends down below the round part of the letter form, that would be called a descender. Also, what we classify as the imaginary line that text sits on is considered the baseline. Okay, just so you know. So there's a little more information in this type anatomy diagram than in this slide over here. But for the most part, it covers basically the same amount of information. The other thing that's on here that I'd like to point out at this point is the difference, the visual difference between a serif typeface, which is what Garamond is, that's this here, and a sans serif typeface, which is what this is, Tahoma. And if you notice, the serif typeface has these little feet that are down in through here, and I don't know, I don't think I can draw on here. No, I won't mess with it because I might lose my cursor. Okay, I have a drawing tablet here. I was going to draw on the slide, but I don't think I can. Okay, so I wanted to point that out in this slide. Okay, okay. Legibility of body text varies for different audiences. So in other words, it's important to note who you're designing your piece for, because depending on the audience, you may have to deal with different sizes of text. For instance, younger audiences may be able to read font sizes that are 8 or 9 points. However, older audiences need to see things that are at least 10 point or above just for legibility. And generally, I say font sizes above 14, break down the continuity of the text, making text appear too gray. So, font sizes that are above 14 will kind of appear on the edges as just a tad bit gray. So, you need to remember these things as you're working with text. And again, that last statement I think applies a lot to screen text mostly. And you can kind of see it. Maybe perhaps looking at your screen right now, you can see that sort of halo effect that takes place around the text. Okay. If letters or words or lines are too close together, readers have a hard time because text blocks tend to look too dark. And this is an important statement to remember, especially for screen designers, such as animators or people working with After Effects or doing kinetic type. A lot of times, if letters are too close, it'll be difficult for someone to read that word on a screen. Doesn't necessarily always apply as much to print matter, things that you can hold in your hand, but a lot of times web design and screen text have issues with that. If letters are too far apart, readers will have a hard time figuring out what the word says. There'll be too much light, and it'll cause issues with our sensory organs in our eyes because there's too much light showing through. So considering the amount of space that you put in your words and how tight or how loose your lines of text look are very important to how legible they are. Now, for the first phase of your book project, you will be working on, dealing with alignment. And you have a lot of options when it comes to alignment. You have text that is flush left, like this text here, flush left, and they call this rag right. Here is more lines of text, which are also flush left, rag right. Now, one of the things you want to keep in mind when working with text that has a rag on one end, whoops, that has a, Command Z this, has a rag on one end. I don't know what I did here. Okay, there we go. And when I mean rag, I mean like a jagged edge on one end and a lined edge on the other. So this would be flush and this would be considered rag. A lot of times you want to make sure that your rag is nice and smooth. So you want to make sure that the line lengths are relatively even. As you can kind of see, this person took time um, to return these lines at the right place. And what I mean by return is I hit a return and it brings that information down, and I hit a return here and it brings that information down. So you want to make sure that your rag is nice and as smooth as it can be. Justified text, that is text that is flush on both sides. So you can kind of see here we have text on both sides that is flush. But what happens in those particular examples is you end up with this white space like this. You see this in here. And that's really not desirable. So what you could do is you can come in here and you can bring some words up or bring some words down using returns to fill out some of these lines a bit better. Okay, so using alignment is pretty important, and you'll be using alignment quite a bit in your type variations book. Okay, let's see. Centered text. That can also be very elegant and can also be a way for you to control the way piece looks and um, create some kind of continuity. Here again is a rag, and you can kind of see how tightly adjusted this rag is. This person did a pretty neat job. Over here, this is your centered text. Now, what you want to kind of strive for with centered text is you want to kind of create, like, I call it a bowl. If I can draw this, this is the tough thing about lecturing. In a video is I don't have a board that I can draw on. And I know there's all kinds of technology, but I haven't been provided with all the tools to do this professionally. So again, back to what I was saying here, what I try to create is a sense of diagonal on both sides of my text, and that it comes down into like a bowl shape. So if I move my cursor down and across, that would be the base of the bowl, and then up and across, that would be considered like a bowl shape. So if you think of it like that, when you're working with centered copy. Right aligned is the opposite of flush left aligned, where on the right edge, your copy is flush, and on the left edge, your copy is rag. And that's what they call this here. This is that rag. Notice that this designer has also taken the time, and I might actually disagree with the way they set this rag up. They could probably bring this word and down and fill this space a bit better. So as you're working with your text in your Typephases book, you want to think about those things, adjusting your rag. Okay. Um, and again, you won't be working with this as much on this project, but on the next project in this class you will. But for right now, what you need to learn from this slide is that almost every typeface out there that you can choose has a kind of sense of style about it or a personality. And sometimes it can actually make a statement. Personally, sometimes text makes too much of a statement, and the statement should be left to the imagery or to the artwork of the piece, or maybe perhaps the design. Um, I'm a believer of some of the simplest text options being the best, such as Garamond or Franklin Gothic or Helvetica, because they're not highly stylized. They don't really have a strong personality, and they fit into many, many advertising and communications. And they just sort of work on their own. They don't dominate, they're not hidden. They just balance out the whole piece. So, again, I really think it's important to note that all text kind of has its own sort of personality about it. Let's see, 11. Now, keep in mind as you're working through your book that you're going to have headlines, you're going to have subheads, and you're going to need to make sure that they're at the right weight and the right size so that they stand out and catch your audience's attention. And it explains here for headings, consider an audience, such as teenagers respond to different fonts differently than business people or academics. So if you choose a certain size or a certain stylized font, your audience is going to react to that particular choice based on what target market or what market they sort of fall within. Um, a lot of times, font families that support your subject matter or deliberately use contrast work to your advantage. And again, this goes back to using, font style. I chose that font because it gave me that grunge feel, or I chose that font because it looked very elegant. That's what I'm talking about, that kind of personality, sense of personality there. Okay, let me scroll up here. Um, Alignment of text creates a line in your design. Such lines help readers draw connections between different parts of your design. So, again, you'll be working with this idea in the beginning part of your Typephases book, and you'll be continuing with this idea, lining things up on the grid, text blocks that line up with headlines or subheads that line up with headlines. make a sense of unity and alignment and similarity within your work. And it helps the viewer's eye transition from one area of the layout to the other. To maintain an overall uniformity, limit the number of different font families per page to one or two, as I mentioned early in the slide presentation. And this is really just one of those, best practice things to do in projects that have too many typefaces and that have, five and six and different, five, six different fonts. It becomes too messy. It becomes very random. The eyes of the viewer tend to jut around the page. They don't know where to land. The message is confusing. So it works against you in many, many ways. Um, Using the same font family throughout creates uniformity, as I mentioned, but may make documents seem flatter and interesting. So you can add interest by contrasting the display type with the body copy. And I agree with this message because I have seen pieces that just look drab because it's using all the same typeface. There's no contrast. So what you might do if you are choosing two typefaces is what they suggest here is make your headlines in one typeface and your body copy in the other for some contrast. It's a good idea. Um, and in your phases book, you get to a point where one of your phases you're allowed to use both Times and Helvetica. And I highly recommend that you practice some of these options that they give you in this slide presentation, such as this. Let's see, uh, number 15 here. Um, and they explain it here. They're giving you an example of how you can go about doing, and they give you a visual example of how that contrast looks. So here's an example of a headline using a sans serif typeface, and the body copy or the subheads are using a serif typeface. And you can kind of see how nice the contrast looks. Um, Kind of an interesting design going on here. Here's another example of things you can do with headlines besides changing the typeface. You can apply tracking, which is what I was talking about a couple slides earlier, where you can come in and put extra letter or extra space between each letter to kind of, I call it track out that particular line of text. However, you don't want to do too much tracking because then the line of text becomes illegible and it almost looks like separate letter forms. So watch how you tweak this because it could go too far in one direction. Um, Again, I mentioned in the type anatomy handout that I gave you back here, I mentioned the baseline and that being the area that the line of text sits on. It's kind of like an imaginary line. And if I go back here, you'll see that um, some suggestions for manipulating text or treating text differently is bumping a letter form below the baseline for a different look, bumping letter forms above the baseline for different looks. These are all what I would call type treatments. And these are all things you can do as you're working through your type phases book. You can play around with letter forms and try and make those letter forms look like different things. They call this kind of onomatopoeia, where you actually have a line of text that takes on the form of what the word sounds like or looks like, which is kind of what's happening here with this shaking example. Kind of a neat little thing. Um, Use typography to guide readers through the levels of your document. So again, I might change that word levels to phases. So you're going to use text to lead me from one chapter to the other, piquing my interest with each phase because you're going to be doing such unique things as you start working through those phases. This will definitely help your audience to navigate through your piece so that they can get from start to finish. The worst thing that can happen is that the viewer opens a couple of pages, shuts your book, and never looks at it again. You want to encourage and engage your viewer, engage them into becoming enthralled with your piece and actually studying the entire piece. That's your job as a designer, is to kind of engage and promote that sort of curiosity in whatever it is you're presenting. I mentioned this word, I think, in other lectures, but the definition for it is listed here. It's also in your project handout, hierarchy. And the definition of hierarchy is helping your audience distinguish between levels of information, such as headers versus body copy. So um, it's a sense of sort of showing importance in a sense. I mean, where do you want your viewer to land first, and where do you want them to land second and third, and so on. It's kind of a hierarchy system of managing what the viewer reads and what the viewer can either not read or continue to read. You kind of are able to control um, their readability or their eye flow through your particular piece. So hierarchy is a pretty important thing, and you're going to want to be mindful of it as you're working through your designs. And here is an example of what hierarchy is and how to use it with just text. And you can kind of see here the unconventional font used here. Something you won't have available for this project, but you can see how much style that unconventional font has. It almost gives this piece a specific kind of look, which is why I kind of like am half on the fence with fonts that look like that. However, the second line that you see in this example here, this is in Helvetica, you can kind of see though the larger, bolder headline in the unconventional font kind of takes hierarchy here because it looks so uniquely different. And then you can also use color to change the system up a little bit. So they were trying to color coordinate here where they applied red for the header, and now they're applying red down here for some of these subheads and such. So a pretty good idea for trying to show hierarchy using color, using size, using weight, and those different kinds of things. Unconventional text or fonts. Okay, so to summarize basically what I talked about here, typography can play a key role in your design. That is, if you know how to use it. If you don't, it could just look like a bunch of redundant letters next to each other that just says something, and it can be so much more than that. And that's why you're here in school, is to learn how to actually tap into all of those characteristics. Good typography starts with font family. So an extended font family is a great idea. Choose those to meet your design goals, but keep them limited. As I said, choose only one or two typefaces per project to keep it simple and structured and similar. Use text alignment to create relationships between different kinds of information. So aligning text at the flush edge of things, or using your grid for alignment is a great way to create relationships between information. Create contrast by using a serif font for headers and sans serif fonts for body copy, or vice versa. You can use bold and italics, tracking, and color to also show contrast, as we've looked at in a couple other examples there. And then last but not least, use contrast to indicate hierarchy, which is very, very important when you're designing compositions such as what you're doing. You're going to be doing 24 of these. So you're going to want to remember in each and every one of your 6x6 compositions, you're going to have a different state of hierarchy. So you're going to need to be mindful of hierarchy in each one of them. Okay, so this should give you a good overview of some of the things to think about to improve your typography for your type variations book.